This interest in this subject came naturally because I worked for the Ukrainian section of Radio Canada International for several years before it was closed 2 years ago. I don't know how many of you know that it existed to start with, because a lot of Ukrainians here in Canada don't know about it, and it was part of the problem why the last time we were not able to defend the section. But anyway, this is how my interest about this subject came about. And I'll talk only about the first years of this section, which was founded in 1952. I'm talking about the Ukrainian section of International Service of Radio Canada International, of CBC, as it was called till the 60s. I'll talk a little bit about the general rationale behind the creation of the International Service of CBC in the first place, and then I'll talk about it a little bit about the Cold War ambience that was prevalent in Canada by the end of 40s, and then I'll switch to specifically Ukrainian section. The creation of Radio Canada International Service, as it was known in the beginning, came about in the general self-identification of Canada as a national country, because a lot of Western countries were engaging were opening this shortwave broadcasting as a way of projecting the national images abroad, and Canada was involved in this discussion too. The debates on the Canadian level about this shortwave broadcasting started in the 30s. It took several years because there were also technical problems involved with this shortwave broadcasting, but after all these deliberations and solving all the technical difficulties, the first Canadian shortwave program went on air on Christmas Day of 1944 to Canadian troops overseas. And the international service was created by an order in council with a specific mandate. First one was to establish close contacts with Canadian troops overseas, to supply the United Kingdom, the rest of the Commonwealth and other countries with accurate and timely information about Canada and the national war effort, to provide essential means of self-defense and counterattack against the continuous flow of propaganda from Germany and Italy directed against Canada, and to provide a second line of defense if the enemy were able to put the BBC stations out of operation. And of course it was to boost up the morale of people within the occupied countries of Europe. So we have this dimension of propaganda already embedded in the mandate of the International Service of Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And the first, and I'll ask first. This is the policy of the broadcasting and the mandate of the International Service of Radio Canada International. It was formulated by Ira Gilbert, the General Supervisor of the International Service, how he put it in 1949. The basic philosophy behind the Voice of Canada, the service came to be called, is that in this complicated age, nation must speak to nation. In this speaking must be simple and straightforward, honest and frank, free from bias and negative propaganda. We feel that the service should be, as far as possible, friendly rather than impersonal, reflecting abroad the true character, the institutions, the habits and the aspiration of the Canadian people. The International Service originally broadcasted in 5 languages: English, French, German, Dutch and Czech. Czech seems a peculiar choice, but it was basically because there were 2 employees of the International Service who were from former Czechoslovakia, so they persuaded the CBC management that it was really essential to broadcast, and at that time, when all these debates were going, the organizational preparation for the opening of the service was underway. The Czech Republic was still under German occupation. From the beginning, the Canadian International Service tried to follow the standards of journalistic broadcast set by BBC. That is, they tried to present both sides of events, And the ultimate aim was to learn the same reputation as BBC had already, but with a strictly Canadian flavor. After the war, the bedrock of the operation remained the same that they had during the war, that is to reflect Canada, its democratic way of life, its diverse population, trade opportunities, the culture and interests of its people. But as we all know, the political events changed the general atmosphere in the international political arena, and by the early 1950s, the Canadian government had decided that in the struggle for men's minds, as it became known on Parliament Hill, the voice of Canada would be a key instrument of official Canadian policy. Basically, the Canadian government, after long deliberation, decided to go ahead and join this war of ideas that has been already led by the States and the BBC. And I'll ask Maxim to put the next slide. These are quotes from the appearance of Lester Pearson before the Standing Committee on External Affairs to explain the policy that the International Service would pursue in Eastern European broadcasts. So I won't read the quote, you can read it by... no, sorry, it was... this quote is good as well to... because he officially he said in his appearance before the Standing Committee, he said that the threat of Soviet imperialism established a need for the participation in the war of ideas. So this is when Canada decided to go ahead. Pearson continued, those countries beyond the Iron Curtain must receive programming that will check the inroads of Soviet imperialism in an attempt to bring truth about the West and about Soviet imperialism, and to strengthen the morale, faith and determination of the many friends of freedom and democracy who still live behind the Iron Curtain, but whose voices have been silenced. So the main line of broadcasting to Eastern Europe was still trying to maintain that objectivity, but because it was the main point when the Canadian government was deliberating if Canada should engage in this war, they didn't manage expressions, and they really, some broadcasts in the States, they people would use some really harsh, not hard, but I mean, emotionally loaded expression. Canadians, they wanted to keep to those journalistic standards. That's why it took several years before they officially formulated this policy. And one of the four objectives of international service broadcasting in 1954 was formulated like this, that the Eastern European broadcast has to provide a reliable source of international and Canadian news for peoples of Eastern Europe, to counteract communist propaganda about the Western world through news, factual information, a vigorous statement of our views on current topics, to encourage the Soviet people to question their governmental policies and to oppose its aggression tactics, and in the satellite countries to keep alive the contact with Western democratic life and seek to frustrate the efforts of Soviet domination. And I found this quote really telling, because the Eastern European broadcast has always come under attacks. On behalf of the government, and I'll illustrate it later, but on behalf of the people from the other side as well, who were not satisfied with Canada's very mild criticism, or if that criticism was present at all, of communist ideals and the Soviet imperialism. And for instance, this quote from Honorable Ambrose Holowach from Edmonton East, who was who always defended the shortwave service and opposed budget cuts, to which the international service was always under danger, because it occupied the gray zone between they didn't depend directly on the external affairs or foreign policy at that time, but they always had to keep in mind what were Canada's priorities in international relations, because although they weren't, like I said, they weren't part administratively, they weren't part of the External Affairs Department, but they were considered the voice of Canada abroad. It projected, it was the only organization that was projecting Canada's image abroad, because there were no newspapers, no journals, nothing that would represent Canada internationally. So the External Affairs has always surveyed the broadcast, especially toward Eastern Europe. And they had always, there was the standing committee created within the government, and then they would have regular hearings of the standing committee to which the managers of the International Service were invited to inform the government about the broadcast. And this is a quote from one of those sessions. So this Honorable Ambrose Holowach says he had listened he talked with some Europeans about the Canadian broadcasting abroad. And this is what he says about these discussions. I was astonished. They told me of broadcasts to countries behind the Iron Curtain on such subjects as Eskimos, our northern lands, dog-sled races, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and reindeer herds. Imagine someone behind the Iron Curtain crawling into the loft of a barn or into a haystack where a radio is hidden, tense with anticipation, tense to receive a vibrant message. He turns the knob, and what does he get? Talks on reindeer and on the St. Lawrence Seaway. So it just to demonstrate, to show you how that international service has always been caught between this hard place and rock, because they didn't have to satisfy these both camps, but they came under attack quite often. And also, while they were, there was also this moral feeling of obligation to broadcast to people behind the Iron Curtain, because they didn't have access to objective news, and all they had was state propaganda. So it was one of the main factors that weighed in the decision to go ahead and open the broadcast to Eastern Europe. The opening now, and I come directly to the opening of the Ukrainian section. Because shortly after the inauguration of the Russian service in 1950, External Affairs asked Canadian diplomats in London and Washington to provide some opinion from the British and Americans about the Ukrainian nationalism and the advantages of the Ukrainian shortwave program in the present Cold War. In this memo, the Canadian government, one of the officials of the External Affairs noted that Ottawa found the whole Ukrainian issue perplexing and felt that, quote, the greatest caution must be exercised in exploiting Ukrainian nationalism either now or in wartime, end of quote. And can you put the next slide, please? Is it? No, I probably didn't. No, that's okay. So sorry, you can leave it there. And I'll continue quoting this. I thought that I put it, but I didn't anyway. So this is the quote from this memo about the Ukrainian nationalism and how worried were External Affairs about this Ukrainian nationalism. First of all, there are in Canada important political aspects to the question arising from the existence of various rival Ukrainian organizations embracing the large numbers of Canadian citizens. Furthermore, the experience of the two great wars has left a legacy of the greatest reluctance to make promises or even mild hints of support for the future independence for national minorities. Finally, we feel that the risk of losing more than it is hoped to gain must be weighed very carefully. It is arguable that by appealing to and possibly pleasing one Ukrainian, we may antagonize 2.5 Russians. So it was really for External Affairs, they had taken a really firm position of opposing the broadcast in Ukrainian language. And mainly the reason is because, well, they didn't want to break this balance that they had in broadcasting in Russian language. But it wasn't External Affairs issues that really played the decisive role in the opening of Ukrainian broadcast. It was Canadian internal policies, and namely, I guess it's not hard to guess, it was the very strong lobbying on behalf of the Ukrainian community to open the section in Ukrainian. For instance, on June 23rd, 1951, Homin Ukrainy published an editorial appealing to its readers to send petitions and letters to External Affairs Minister Lester Pearson and to the CBC manager in favor of Ukrainian broadcasts. On its front page, they published a letter in English addressed to Pearson with a blank space at the bottom for signature. The newspaper also called for the creation of regional committees to help in the lobbying process. And Ottawa, well, the official Ottawa was bracing itself for a flow of letters from 350,000 Ukrainians or Ukrainian Canadians. But they were, the External Affairs was heartened by what they called an indifferent response, because they received only 4 or 5 petitions. But obviously it was too early to make any conclusion, because on October 19th, External Affairs Minister Pearson received a letter from the Secretary General of the Canadian League for Ukraine's Independence, Ukraine's Liberation, calling for the inclusion of the Ukrainian language broadcasts in the Voice of Canada that was at that time broadcasting in 13 languages. And with that letter came a binding case containing sheets with 11,741 signatures. And the petition carried a reminder, if one needed a reminder, that Ukrainian Canadians are the largest racial group and one of the fundamental ethnic elements of the Canadian nation. And this quote is the reaction of the External Affairs to this letter and the case, because they said that even the name of the organization, Canadian League for Ukraine's Liberation, confirmed the earlier fears that they had about this Ukrainian nationalism. So I'll just quote the first. Much of the Ukrainian Canadian reasoning submitted in support of the plea for Ukrainian broadcasts was sophistry behind which lurked the desire to forward the cause of Ukrainian independence, that is, dismembered of the USSR. And while all these debates within the External Affairs were taking no, I'll just say that after this petition, Lester Pearson decided, in spite of all this opposition that External Affairs voiced, he decided to go ahead and called, not him personally directly, but he asked one of his employees to call the International Service in Montreal and to say that he would like the Ukrainian broadcast begin as soon as possible. So Ira Gilbert, who was still the first Director General of the International Service, he was obviously worried about the broadcasting policy, because he as a director, he had to although the International Service never had censure or editorial control, but still he was responsible for what was going out, because it was, well, it was Canada's voice internationally. So he said that the way he understood it, that Ukrainian broadcasts would not represent a sort of separatist movement, and that Canada would be broadcasting to the Soviet Union in Ukrainian, and not broadcasting to the Ukraine or the separate part of the USSR. So, and this became a main policy formulation for broadcasting in Ukrainian by international service. And since he received the clear instructions from the top, he proceeded to practical putting in place the service. And what he did, he sent his representative to Washington to have some consultation with the Voice of America, who was already broadcasting in Ukrainian at that time. BBC, they didn't have broadcasting in Ukrainian until 1991 or 92, when Ukraine became independent. So Canada opening a foreign service broadcast in Ukrainian, it was really a very important event. So this representative of International Service of CBC, he went to Washington and he came back with some suggestions about what the broadcasting policy should be. Okay. What content of programs should be, and what the position of the management of the International Service should be vis-a-vis what they saw as very active Ukrainian lobbying. because obviously they were monitored what was going on. So he came back, and this is what he suggested. He said that American programs are definitely programs to the USSR in the Ukrainian language and not directed to the Ukraine as a separate political unit. Any difference between Ukraine and the USSR stressed in these broadcasts are of cultural rather than of a political nature. On the political side, the general fight for freedom and the struggle against communism are emphasized. All national aspiration must be left to the people themselves, who in the end will decide if and when the proper time comes, whether they want to become independent, join in a federation with the other peoples of the USSR, etc. No reference is made in this broadcast to any underground movement or underground army within the Ukraine or to any fighting liberation movement. And he also recommended that the management of the International Service takes a very firm position with regards to various groups within the Ukrainian community. And therefore he recommended to prepare a definite policy statement containing all the elements mentioned in the paragraph I just quoted, and to publish the statement in the form of a press release before or simultaneously with the inauguration of the broadcasts. And he stressed that the necessity to conform strictly to these policies, to official government policies, and he said as they unquestionably must. Because this is all interferences in matter of policy as well in the actual preparation of this program must be avoided at all costs. So the government, here we have this position again, the government, he doesn't intervene directly, but still the management of the international service, like I said, they always had to take into consideration what were the priorities of Canada internationally. And 3 months later, they proceeded to hiring the staff for the Ukrainian section, and they came. It was the interviewing process took place here in Toronto in 1951. There were two of them. One was a Czech lawyer, Jewish Czech lawyer, Dr. Smolka, and a member of the Russian section, Vladimir Rayevsky, who spoke Ukrainian with a native fluency. So they interviewed these candidates. They were looking for editors and typewriters. And the basic competence they were looking for, it was just the knowledge of English and Ukrainian. Because if you are looking now, when they are hiring people to work in the international broadcasting, they are looking at their journalistic experience, their credentials, and it's not enough, obviously, to know just languages. But at that time, it was probably because those people were non-existent. Knowledge of English and Ukrainian was the only competence they were looking for. And I found this also, I don't know if I can call it, funny that they, all the editors were male and all the typewriters were females. And editors had a very good knowledge of Ukrainian and not sufficient knowledge of English, while all the women who were interviewed, they all knew English, but they didn't have sufficient knowledge of Ukrainian, presumably because they were born in Canada. So with all these negotiations and problems, the Ukrainian service was inaugurated on Canada Day on July 1st, 1952 by Jean Désir, who was the General Director of the International Service at that time. And Lester Pearson, unfortunately I wasn't able to find the first program. I know it exists, I just didn't have time to find it, to listen to it. This is what I found in one of the monographs written about the history of the Radio Canada International. So Lester Pearson, he opened the Ukrainian transmission with a statement that did not reflect his private apprehensions about all of which I talked before. He noted that Canadians of Ukrainian origin formed one of the larger of the national groups, which, added to the basic British and French elements of the population, make up the Canadian people. And he said that one of the purposes of the program was to tell Canadians, or to tell listeners about Canadians of Ukrainian origin. or who came from the Ukraine. Another purpose was to bring truthful, unbiased information about the world and world events. And Pearson added that Canada sought to penetrate the artificial wall, which the Soviet authorities had erected, and the broadcast would seek to establish contact between Canadian people and the Ukrainian people. Okay, so I'll just tell this story about Panchuk, and that's it. Because Panchuk was the head of the first head of the Ukrainian section, and he was I'm sorry, I did anyway. He occupied that position for 5 years, and then they had to fire him because he would obviously follow this line, his own policies, which was against communism and against. They had their own policies, and the direction of the CBC. They finally had to fire him because he was really reluctant to listen to these recommendations that CBC management would formulate. And for instance, when Jean Désir, because the External Affairs, they were annoyed with these scripts. All other scripts were okay, but scripts that were dealing with the Ukrainian nationalism were deemed of a very poor quality by the External Affairs especially. And when they sent a memo that we were dissatisfied with the quality of the Ukrainian broadcasting, Jean Désir, who was the general director, he normally didn't deal with the heads of the section. But in that case, he had to intervene, and he wrote a short paragraph saying that you should follow the lines that were established by our management. And Panchuk wrote a 12 pages memo in a couple of days where he argumented why they were following this policy. And Désir responded with a short paragraph saying that, you know, I am not interested in all this reasoning. All I want to know that you follow this policy. Panchuk replied with another 11 pages memo. So obviously he was he wasn't an easy character to deal with. So after 5 years they fired him, and then they hired a Canadian, Carol Chipman. And just the last quotation, he said, I was told that it was easier to me to learn Ukrainian than to teach a European Ukrainian to become a Canadian. So I'm